Looks like Zach Bogosian is going nowhere as he signs a new 2-year extension with the Minnesota Wild. His deal, though, has a glaring omission compared to other recent Bill Guerin extensions. We'll discuss, as well as taking a look at what the D pairings could be heading into next year. All on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duham, and this is Locked on Wild.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week, especially here in trade deadline week. There expects to be some action between now and Friday at 2 p.m., so make sure you don't miss out on anything related to the Minnesota Wild. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we break down the news that Zach Bogosian will be sticking around as he signs a new 2-year extension, but it has no trade protection. So we'll talk about that key piece to this deal, as well as where Bogosian slots in amongst the rest of the Wild's decor. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, credentialed Minnesota Wild media member, and Zach Bogosian was a name that we thought maybe would be dealt here before the trade deadline, but there were also rumblings that Bill Guerin wanted to try to lock him in to an extension to stick around as a piece for this Minnesota Wild team, and turns out the extension won out in this case. Bogosian signing a 2-year extension that has a total value of $2.5 million. So his AAV will be $1.25 million, same as his cap hit. The key piece here, zero trade protection. And so what this says to me right off the bat is that the Wild have liked what they've received from Zach Bogosian so far this season, both as a veteran presence and a guy who went from being the 7th defenseman for the Tampa Bay Lightning to being a piece that can reliably move up and down the lineup, as the Wild defensively have had no shortage of injuries throughout the season. But he's also been a good veteran fit from a leadership perspective for this group as well. And as this season goes not according to plan, the Wilds continue to take a look at ways to turn the page to next year, which, if you look at the decor, should feature some changes between now and next season. But let's look at what Bogosian has brought to the table. The big piece regarding Bogosian was, when he came here, was that he just didn't get into the lineup for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Only played in 4 games with the Lightning. And so I remember one of the things we discussed when Bogosian was acquired by the Minnesota Wild was that he just was looking for an opportunity to get a little bit more consistent playing time and actually crack the lineup, which he has done 43 times for the Minnesota Wild since. His numbers as a whole, playing 17 minutes, 36 seconds per night on average. 1 goal, 8 assists, so 9 total points. He's a +3 in those 43 games. He has 43 penalty minutes in those 43 games. And 55 shots on goal in 43 games as well, out of 121 total shot attempts. The key pieces: he's got 51 blocks in 43 games and 80 hits as a defenseman. So something that is sorely lacking for the most part with this Wild decor is physical defensemen that throw their body around. This decor is by and large on the small side, whether it be Brock Faber, whether it be Jared Spurgeon, Jonas Brodin on the thin side himself. You just don't have a lot of beef on that decor. And so Bogosian showing he certainly has plenty left in the tank. Is he the most fleet of foot? No. Is he somebody that is really capable to provide you a ton of points? Is he an upper echelon defenseman? No. But what he has been, I think, has been just a steadying presence for a D-core that has just had so many injuries they've had to weather this season. Think about the number of players that we have seen that were not expected to be part of this D-core at the beginning of the season. We have, since the season started, added Zach Bogosian, Dakota Mermis, Declan Chisholm, Daemon Hunt has played at points throughout the season. You're missing right now Jared Spurgeon, who's out for the year. Jonas Brodin has missed time this season. Brock Faber has played pretty much every game, but is showing signs of wearing down as we move through the final 20 games of the season. Jake Middleton's been relatively healthy, but then you have the other two in Alex Goligoski and John Merrill that have been wildly inconsistent, although in some of these numbers that we're going to read off in segment 2, starting to think this entire D-core may have just been sabotaged by bad goalie play, because some of these numbers that I'm going to read off are a little bit eye-popping. But I like, by and large, what Bogosian has brought to the table. He's not afraid to shoot the puck when he has it. He's not afraid to push the puck up the ice. He has been a great veteran leadership piece. Daemon Hunt raved about Zach Bogosian when he was up here, kind of helping him learn what needed to happen at the NHL level. That's the kind of thing that really sticks out to me too. And some may look at that and say, well, it doesn't really factor in a ton, but as this team goes to where we're hoping that they get to over these next couple of seasons, with continuing to add more and more young pieces to this mix, having a guy like that who can just make it a little easier for a young player coming up to the NHL level and not being afraid to step in and say, I'll show you the ropes. Absolutely. Is something that I think is kind of a cool under discussed piece of this. And so by and large, it's a 2-year deal that features a salary in the millions, 1.25, no trade protection. And so if Bogosian is here as a veteran piece, that's fine. If the Wild fall out of it again next year and you're looking for players to deal at the deadline, he certainly fits under that category. So the Wild's comfortable enough to extend Zach Bogosian. And we'll talk too at the end of today's episode why this doesn't necessarily signal the end to Daemon Hunt's opportunities with the Minnesota Wild next season. But what I want to do is just kind of dive in next segment and look at how some of these pairings have played out throughout the season, and also just talk about, what we're looking at for this D-core. We talked a lot about Declan Chisholm today and how he has taken the most of an opportunity and put himself into the conversation for next year as well. And so we'll kind of piggyback off of that, a defenseman heavy day of Locked On Wild here today, but obviously wanted to get some breaking news out with the fact that Zach Bogosian has re-upped for 2 more years to stay here in Minnesota. And so we will come back and we'll take a look at some of these pairings and which ones have been most optimal for the Minnesota Wild this season? The answers will surprise you. That's all on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. And as we move through the final 2 months of the regular season, you can still win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked on NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether your favorite Minnesota Wild players, Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, Brock Faber, Matt Boldy, maybe Zach Bogosian. Pick whether they record more or less than their Sleeper projections for categories such as goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in a given game. It's so easy. You can set your lineup in under 60 seconds. And if you're a fan of other sports, you can play daily fantasy NFL, NBA, MLB, and college football on Sleeper too. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder for the rest of the week, we will keep you up to date with all of the latest regarding Minnesota Wild players who could potentially be moved by the deadline, players that are moved by the deadline, whatever happens by the deadline, we've got you covered here at Locked on Wild. So let's just look at the picture for the Wild on defense heading into next season, because now Zach Bogosian slots in squarely in the conversation for this D-core. Here are the names that will be out as of this point. Alex Goligoski is an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season. I don't see any legitimate way that Alex Goligoski comes back to be a part-time player. If even that, I think at this point, this is his ends to his career, and he will retire, and that will be it. So that spot is open. Dakota Mermis, also an unrestricted free agent at the end of this season. It would not shock me at all if the Minnesota Wild try to sign him to add him in to the depth of this organization going forward. He's been a reliable portion of this D-core who has been asked to fill several games and minutes throughout the season. So it wouldn't shock me at all if the Minnesota Wild try to keep him around. At the very least, he's a leadership piece for an Iowa Wild team that is in desperate need of some leadership pieces. But it doesn't feel like, I feel like what we have seen is an admission here that the Wild need to upgrade what they've had in the lineup on that third pairing. John Merrill is, as of right now, signed for $1.2 million next season. Honestly, it's not going to shock me, especially if the Vancouver Canucks have been linked to John Merrill and have kicked the tires. I would hope that Bill Guerin realizes where this team is at and understands that you can do better. You can do better with a young player in that spot. Veterans are great for a team that is in the postseason picture, but veterans also give you a ceiling, and young players give you the opportunity to exceed that and to pleasantly surprise you with what they're able to bring to the table. And so I'm going to, at this point, say that those two positions in this D-core Actually, those 3 positions will not be filled by the same players. I'm not going to be shocked if Dakota Mermis re-ups here, but there is also going to be some competition to sign him. If anybody has seen what he's done this season, wouldn't surprise me if he gets some offers, legitimate NHL offers to go elsewhere at this point. And he's 30. So if somebody's going to give him an NHL shot, he would be foolish to pass that up. So it's likely that you have to replace Goligoski, Merrill, and Mermis next season. And so you got Brodin, Middleton, Faber, and Bogosian all locked in. That's 4. You got Declan Chisholm, who the Wild have his rights as a restricted free agent. Just spent an episode earlier today talking about what he has brought to the table, and I would like to see that furthered over the next couple of seasons. So that's 5. Jared Spurgeon, as of right now, is penciled in for that 6th spot. But I gotta be honest, folks, and this is not a new claim from me. If you've listened to this show since the news that Jared Spurgeon was going to be done for the year due to back and hip surgeries, I am not comfortable at all simply saying, yeah, we'll pencil him in. We'll pencil him into the mix next year after he gets these surgeries done, after he heals up. It's a monumental recovery for both. And so I just am not comfortable at this point even assuming that he's going to be able to come back. It wouldn't shock me if he does, but that's why I'm of the belief right now that I don't think signing Zach Bogosian prevents Daemon Hunt from playing a major role on this team defensively next year. So let's just say Spurgeon starts the year on injured reserve. Daemon Hunt then would give you 6. So that would be your 6th defenseman heading into next season. But that's just to fill the lineup. Like, you would still need somebody to be your 7th, and that's assuming nobody else gets hurt. And so even if Jared Spurgeon does start the season with the team, you've got to have a 7th defenseman on this roster. Now, is it possible the Wild don't do anything with John Merrill? Absolutely. But we've also seen large stretches of time in which he does not get into the lineup. And so I don't think the team is particularly enamored with what they've seen from him, but is, because of how things are playing out, they are keeping him on the roster because he's a body at this point. So next year, even if Spurgeon does start the year with the team, you got to have a legitimate contingency plan in the event that he gets hurt. And we've seen Jonas Brodin over the last few seasons. He's missed games from time to time himself. And this is not even factoring in the potential for something to go massively wrong like it did this year. So as much as we want to see, well, get Daemon Hunt up here, get Carson Lambos up here, I don't think this is going to prevent Daemon Hunt from getting a good amount of time defensively with the Minnesota Wild next season. And on the Carson Lambos front, honestly, folks, haven't really seen anything that has stood out to the point that it screams he's ready to go. So you're probably going to need another year for him in Iowa to start to build up and to just show the signs of a guy that's ready at the NHL level. So even adding Goligoski adding Bogosian into this mix, like, there's still going to be plenty of opportunities. We'll still see plenty of Daemon Hunt over the course of the season, because what inevitably happens with a team like this that has financial restraints and not a ton in the way of depth? is that something goes wrong. So this group may be mostly locked in, but there are going to be other players that will factor into the games played for this decor. And so Bogosian gives you another guy that can slot up and down the lineup. He can play higher in the lineup. He's played with Jonas Brodin at points this season. Declan Chisholm can slot higher in the lineup. It gives you options. It gives you options and flexibility for how to navigate through large stretches of time with key players out of the lineup. Now, what will the pairings look like? Well, folks, I just have been diving through some of the statistics on moneypuck.com, and you would be surprised at the numbers for some of the pairings that we have scratched our heads at. So we'll talk about that, and we're going to finish today trying to answer the question, have we just been sabotaged by bad goalie play this season? We'll discuss that to finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is also brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we got you covered all the way through the trade deadline as we're starting to see some action here over the last 6 to 7 hours. So we'll keep you posted as we get closer to the deadline and closer to the Minnesota Wild making some moves here to end the week. So let's look at these D pairings, because I'm going to be honest, I was not expecting to see what I did when I dove into the stats as to what have been the most effective pairings for the Minnesota Wild here, at least from a preventing goals perspective. So let's just look, and I did back this up to try to include a few more looks because, you know, Declan Chisholm has basically been part of two main D pairings. And so I wanted to get both of those in here, but also wanted to get a few of Zach Bogosian's pairings in here as well to try to really sell the picture here. Now, the most common D pairing for the Wild this year has been Jake Middleton and Brock Faber. They've played 548.9 minutes, so just under 550 minutes so far this season. They have an expected goals percentage of 48.6, which is, again, expected goals for those that are not super into stats like myself. Expected goals percentage is the percentage of time that you're on the ice when a goal is scored. So let's say your expected goals percentage is 75%. When you're on the ice with that expected goals percentage, 75% of the time, the expectation is that if a goal is scored, it's going to be scored by you or your team. So above 50% is good. Below 50% is not good. And so Middleton and Faber just under 48.6% expected goals percentage. But also keep in mind, that's your top D pairing. And so a lot of the times you're playing the best the other team has to offer. So slightly below 50% is not terrible. But here are the pairings that are above 50%, that are above 60% for expected goals percentage this season. Jake Middleton and Jared Spurgeon, and those two played 155.4 minutes together before Spurgeon was injured and done for the season. They're at 61.5%. So 61.5% of the time, if a goal is scored on the ice, it was going to be by the Minnesota Wild. John Merrill and Zach Bogosian, in 70.5 minutes played together, are at 61.8%. And we know that Dean Evison had the tendency to play his top line with the bottom pairing. And so that kind of checks out in that, you've got your third pairing defenseman with your top line. And if they're controlling play a majority of the time, that checks out. But third on the list, the first pairing is no longer possible because it's Jake Middleton and Kalen Addison. And they were at 63.9% in 36 minutes. But Declan Chisholm and John Merrill at 35.1 minutes are at 58.8%. Jake Middleton and Zach Bogosian in 66 minutes together are at 57.5. Jonas Brodin and Declan Chisholm, 77.3 minutes together, 55.6. And so this doesn't mean a ton. It just means that the Minnesota Wild, with those pairings on the ice, have done a good job of controlling the action when that pairing is out there on the ice. The numbers that I think are more interesting is the expected goals per 60 minutes. And on the season, Jake Middleton and Kalen Addison still leading the way at 3.74 expected goals per 60 minutes. They're doing that much that if you played those two for an entire 60-minute game, you would score 3.74 goals. Second on the team with almost double the ice time is Jonas Brodin and Declan Chisholm at 3.1. Then John Merrill and Zach Bogosian at 2.89 goals, expected goals per 60 minutes, are fourth on the list. And if you go to expected goals against, this is something that comes in handy when tracking defensive metrics. Declan Chisholm and John Merrill are number one on the team with an expected goals against per 60 minutes of 1.2. Then it's Jake Middleton and Zach Bogosian at 1.54. Then it's John Merrill and Zach Bogosian at 1.79. And there are a ton of different combinations. Jonas Brodin and Zach Bogosian, 147.5 minutes played together. Their expected goals are at 2.11 per 60 minutes. Dakota Mermis and Zach Bogosian in 55.5 minutes played together are at 2.16 expected goals against per 60 minutes. And you have to go quite a ways down the list to get to the Goligoski-Merrill pairing, which is at 2.6 goals against per 60 minutes. And that tracks in as the 16th highest, 16th lowest on the team out of a possible 21. You want to know the pairing that was the worst? John Merrill, Kalen Addison at 3.54 expected goals against per 60 minutes. Jake Middleton and Alex Goligoski was 19th at 2.82. And so I find myself looking at this, and at the end of the day, it doesn't mean a whole bunch, I suppose. But it is interesting that we have seen these D pairings out there, and we just kind of roll our eyes when at the end of the day, defensemen are a key part in preventing goals, but they're not the most key part of the equation in a stopping goals perspective. That, of course, is the goalies. And so maybe it is simple enough that we just have been sabotaged by incredibly uneven and mostly not good goalie play all season. Now, as far as the numbers go for pairings that have seen the most ice time, Jonas Brodin and Brock Faber second with 483 minutes, and their expected goals against was 2.15 on the season. And so I think for next year, you pencil in Middleton Spurgeon, Brodin Faber, and Bogosian Chisholm as your six. I think that's what you pencil in to start. And if anybody gets hurt, obviously if Spurgeon is not able to go, or if he gets hurt early on into the season, you slot Brock Faber up a little bit to take on that top pairing, and you move either Bogosian or Chisholm to play with Jonas Brodin. And then that's where Daemon Hunt gets into the lineup. The Wild have options defensively, but I think one thing that I want you to consider as we move through the rest of this season is that I think if the Wild finish with the top 10 pick, I would go defense if it were me. I would select a defenseman to try to add to this prospect pool because Spurgeon's getting older, Brodin's getting older, Jake Middleton is a very serviceable defenseman, but probably not in that same echelon as we've put Spurgeon and Brodin. It'd be great to have somebody that you could slot in with Brock Faber. So something to consider as we move through the rest of this week and into the trade deadline at the end of the week, and even well past that into the offseason and into the NHL draft too. That will do it for today's episode of Locked on Wild, today's bonus episode of Locked on Wild. Make sure to hit the like button as you head out for the day. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure to stay tuned as we will continue to keep you up to date on all Minnesota Wild news throughout the rest of the week. Any trades, any roster news. I'm sure we'll react to Murat Huznadinov when he officially makes his way here to Minnesota. So we've got you covered every single day of the week. And so we make sure to, we'll keep an eye on everything for you. We just ask that you hit those like buttons and those follow and subscribe buttons as well, so it can help us get our reach out there further to other Minnesota Wild fans. We have new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.